Hey guys, tonight we begin with an animal that has quietly ruled humanity through charm, judgment, and a total lack of obedience, the cat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all started with humanity's favourite bad habit, optimism. Around 10,000 years ago, someone in the Fertile Crescent looked at a handful of seeds and said, "What if I just planted these and stayed here forever?" And just like that, agriculture was born, along with taxes, property disputes, and the first HOA complaints. Farming brought food security, which was great, and rats, which were not. Grain stores became tiny rodent resorts, all-you-can-eat buffets with unlimited reproduction. At night, the sound of tiny chewing filled the air, a lullaby of regret for choosing civilization. Then came the African wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, the desert's answer to pest control. Sleek, silent, and fundamentally unimpressed, it strolled into human camps like it owned the lease. It didn't come to help, it came to hunt. But the result was the same. Fewer rats, fewer diseases, and one very confused species of early farmer, wondering why this furry little sociopath kept hanging around. No one tamed the first cats. There was no domestication event. It was more like an extended hostage negotiation. The cats stayed because the food was easy, and the humans tolerated them because the rats weren't. It was the world's first symbiotic relationship, built entirely on mutual indifference. Every now and then, a particularly brave farmer tried to pet one, and learned a valuable lesson about boundaries. The cats didn't purr, they hissed, bit, and went right back to work. And yet, over generations, something strange happened. The least violent cats lived longer around humans, and the humans, against all logic, started liking them. Stockholm Syndrome, but with whiskers. Eventually, cats realized that glaring silently while providing minimum effort guaranteed free food. A lesson that still forms the backbone of every modern feline-human relationship. The rats kept coming. The cats kept killing. And humanity, for the first time in its history, entered into a stable, long-term partnership that didn't immediately end in fire. No contracts, no loyalty, just a quiet understanding. You handle the vermin, and we'll pretend you're cute. And for 10,000 years, that deal has held, proving once again that evolution's favourite joke is letting humans think they're in charge. No one remembers the exact moment humans and cats made a deal, mostly because neither side acknowledged it. It wasn't a handshake, it wasn't a ceremony, and it definitely wasn't mutual respect. It was more of a silent understanding that went something like, "You keep the rats out of the grain, and we'll try not to throw shoes at you." This was the world's first non-verbal labour contract, and it's still legally binding in every household today. The cats didn't move in with humans, they allowed themselves to live nearby. They'd lurk around granaries, pick off a few mice, then stare directly into the souls of farmers as if to say, "You're welcome." And the farmers, bless their desperate hearts, mistook that cold indifference for cooperation. Unlike dogs, who begged, fetched, and built entire religions around human approval, cats treated the partnership like an unpaid internship. They'd disappear for days, return with half a rat, and act like they'd just negotiated world peace. Humans, ever the sentimental idiots, began leaving scraps out for them, convinced they'd earned the animal's affection. It wasn't affection. It was rent. Over generations, the same quiet pattern repeated. The friendliest wildcats, meaning the ones who didn't immediately remove chunks of your forearm, lingered closer to human settlements. They tolerated being around people, occasionally let someone pet them, and managed to look deeply disappointed the entire time. Humans, meanwhile, interpreted every flick of the tail as love. They started painting cats on pottery, carving them into charms, even calling them companions. It was history's first case of mass emotional projection, but make no mistake, cats were still fully wild. They hunted alone, mated loudly, and refused to listen to anyone. And yet, they stayed. Because humans were sloppy, rats were plentiful, and the arrangement worked. So while the rest of the animal kingdom evolved through survival or cooperation, cats evolved through sheer vibe management. They gave nothing, demanded everything, and got it anyway. Thus, the silent contract was born, a 10,000-year agreement between two species who would never fully trust each other, but also couldn't stand being apart. The humans thought they had tamed nature. The cats thought they had found indoor plumbing. Technically, both were right. Domestication, as it turns out, wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a slow, awkward process that probably started with a hungry cat and an overly optimistic farmer. Nobody tamed anything. They just tolerated each other until evolution got bored and made it official. Over time, something strange began to happen. Among all those wildcats prowling the edges of human villages, some were a little less stabby. A few didn't bolt at the first sight of humans, and one or two even allowed themselves to be petted without summoning demons. Those were the ones that survived, because being slightly friendlier meant access to food, warmth, and the occasional idiot willing to share their leftovers. The cats didn't evolve because humans trained them. They evolved because they figured us out. They noticed that if you make big eyes, tilt your head, and pretend to care, humans will feed you. It's the same strategy influencers use today. This wasn't domestication. It was psychological warfare, fought quietly, over generations, with purring as the main weapon. Humans, of course, thought they were in control. They started referring to the animals as our cats, as though ownership could be declared over a creature that routinely ignored commands, personal space, and property rights. Archaeologists have found ancient pottery showing humans cuddling cats, and you can almost see the confusion on both faces. To the humans, it was love. To the cat, it was a brief hostage situation with snacks. Natural selection favoured the cats that could fake affection. The hissers, the biters, and the emotionally unavailable wanderers, so 95% of them, slowly became outnumbered by their slightly more patient cousins. And from that tiny genetic shift, Felis catus was born, the domesticated cat. Of course, domesticated is a generous term. The modern house cat still retains 95% of its wild genome, which is science's polite way of saying it's just pretending. They don't hunt because they have to. They hunt because they're bored. They don't cuddle for warmth. They cuddle because it makes you drop your guard. So no, cats didn't change to fit human society. Humanity just adapted to living with a beautiful little sociopath that purrs while plotting your downfall. Evolution calls it symbiosis. We call it cute. By around 2000 BCE, humanity had fully fallen for the scam. What started as a practical pest control agreement had evolved into mass emotional dependence. The Egyptians, brilliant architects, mathematicians, and chronic overachievers, looked at cats and decided, yes, this tiny apex predator is clearly divine. Egypt was the world's first cat cult, and it was magnificent. The African wildcat, once a scrappy rodent assassin, was now lounging in palaces wearing gold jewellery. People worshipped them, painted them, and in some cases, fed them better than their servants. Killing one, even by accident, was punishable by death. Imagine explaining to your family that Uncle Horemheb got executed because he stepped on Bastet's favourite furball. At the centre of this feline fanaticism was Bastet, the cat-headed goddess of the home, fertility, and music. Basically the ancient world's version of a Pinterest mom. Her temples were filled with cats that priests fed, groomed, and probably apologised to regularly. Egyptian art is full of them. Sleek, graceful cats sitting under chairs, playing with fish, or judging humans in hieroglyphic silence. They were depicted as protectors of families and destroyers of serpents, though to be fair, most of their actual destroying was probably limited to knocking over things that were expensive. Archaeologists have even uncovered entire cat cemeteries, filled with mummified felines wrapped in linen and tucked away with offerings. One site alone contained over 300,000 cat mummies. That's not religion, that's a national obsession. And the best part? The cats didn't have to do anything to earn it. They just stared into the sun and occasionally pretended to listen. For the Egyptians, the cat embodied something no other animal could: independence. Dogs were loyal, cows were useful, but cats did whatever they wanted and still got worshipped. It was the ultimate power move, and humans for once respected that. So by the time the pyramids were standing and the pharaohs were mummifying their pets, one thing was certain: cats had already won. They went from rodent hunters to living gods in just a few thousand years, and they've been coasting off that reputation ever since. If you wanted proof that ancient Egypt had gone completely cat-brained, you didn't have to look far. You just had to look up. Everywhere you went, there she was. Bastet, the lioness-turned-house cat goddess, smiling serenely from temples, jewellery, and the occasional household altar. She wasn't just worshipped, she was adored. Originally, Bastet was a fierce lion-headed war deity, the kind who'd maul your enemies and look good doing it. But over the centuries, she mellowed. People started depicting her as a domestic cat, gentle and protective. In other words, the gods had done what every cat owner eventually does. They went soft. Her cult exploded across Egypt. Bastet became the patron of music, fertility, motherhood, and, most importantly, good vibes. Her temples in Bubastis were legendary, filled with cats lounging on sunlit altars, purring like tiny engines of holiness. Pilgrims travelled for days to leave offerings: gold trinkets, baskets of fish, and occasionally entire mummified cats. Because apparently, nothing says devotion like gift-wrapping your pet for eternity. Killing a cat, even by accident, was a death sentence. There's an account of a Roman soldier who killed a cat in Alexandria and was torn apart by an angry mob before the pharaoh could intervene. That's right. The empire that conquered the world couldn't survive a domestic feline incident. To the Egyptians, cats weren't pets. They were protectors. They guarded the home from snakes, rodents, and evil spirits, which, statistically speaking, made them more effective than most priests. Families kept them near cradles to watch over infants. Some even believed a cat's purr could heal, a theory modern science still hasn't entirely disproved, though mostly because no one's willing to argue with a cat. Bastet's popularity turned Egypt into the first recorded cat utopia. Temples became sanctuaries where cats could eat, sleep, and ignore worshippers in peace, which honestly still sounds like paradise. Through Bastet, cats ascended from helpful pest killers to divine intermediaries, living proof that the quickest way to immortality is to convince humanity you're slightly mystical and extremely photogenic. It was the perfect arrangement. Egypt gave them temples. The cats gave them indifference, and somehow both sides thought they were the blessed ones. If you thought cats being worshipped was the peak of Egyptian devotion, think again. The ancient Egyptians didn't just love their cats, they wanted them to outlive them, which, let's be honest, was already happening naturally. Welcome to the era of cat mummification, a booming industry of spiritual embalming, linen wrapping, and mass feline flattery. Archaeologists have uncovered cat necropolises, literal cities of the dead, filled with millions of tiny mummies, each one neatly wrapped, labelled, and buried with the kind of ceremony most humans could only dream of. The idea was simple. Cats were sacred to Bastet, so giving one a proper burial brought good fortune in the afterlife. It's the same logic people use today when lighting a candle for their Wi-Fi router. Egyptians believed that by offering cats to the goddess, they were ensuring protection, fertility, and happiness, which is impressive, considering cats don't protect, reproduce on command, or make anyone happy for longer than 5 minutes. But the system got commercial. Demand for mummified cats skyrocketed, and temple priests saw a business opportunity. Entire breeding operations emerged, raising kittens purely for ritual sacrifice. It's dark, yes, but also the earliest example of a full-scale pet economy. Bastet's temple was basically Amazon Prime for divine offerings. Order one cat mummy, receive spiritual blessings in 2 to 3 business days. Some cat mummies were genuine. Others were cheap knockoffs stuffed with straw, feathers, or, in one case, an eel. That means ancient Egypt had fake cat scams, proving once again that capitalism is eternal. Imagine being a devout pilgrim, paying for divine favor, and unwrapping your holy relic only to find something that smells like low tide. Despite the moral and olfactory chaos, the devotion was real. Cats remained untouchable, revered, and hilariously in control. They'd strut through temples, eat sacred offerings, and occasionally swipe jewelry off altars, living gods with zero self-awareness. So yes, in the land of pharaohs and pyramids, entire generations spent their lives embalming animals that couldn't care less. It wasn't just faith, it was mass delusion with good lighting. And through it all, the cats simply blinked slowly, because for them, immortality had already been achieved. By now, cats weren't just animals, they were influencers with divine endorsement deals. Egypt had effectively turned an apex predator into a luxury brand, and business was booming. Bastet was trending. Cat temples had 5-star ratings, and being seen with one of these furry deities said, "I'm spiritually enlightened, but also fashionable." The pharaohs leaned hard into it. Cats appeared on jewelry, pottery, and tomb walls. The message was clear. If you wanted eternal life, it helped to have a cat staring disinterestedly at you while you died. Priests called them symbols of purity. Artists called them muses. Realists called them what they were, tiny narcissists with murder mittens. And they had marketing. The Egyptian artisans who depicted cats knew their audience. Cats were drawn lounging, sleek and perfect, sometimes even wearing gold earrings. No one painted the version that yowled at 3 a.m. or brought half-dead lizards to your doorstep. The myth was carefully curated, the first ever feline PR campaign. Cats became shorthand for divine poise, the living manifestation of balance between chaos and grace. Which is ironic, considering their actual behaviour consisted mostly of knocking fragile things off tables and staring blankly at walls. But the Egyptians were committed. They saw that contradiction and called it mystery. Every noble household had cats, not for pest control anymore, but for prestige. A cat walking into a banquet was like a celebrity cameo. Guests would bow, servants would offer milk, and the cat would ignore everyone because it had more important existential things to do, like staring at the ceiling. The higher classes even began breeding cats selectively, not for friendliness, but for aesthetics. Sleeker coats, darker stripes, more regal stares. Egypt didn't just invent the concept of royalty, it invented the concept of looking royal while doing nothing. In short, cats had gone full divine influencer. They didn't have to perform, contribute, or even care. Their beauty was their power. The more detached they seemed, the more humans adored them, proving that ancient Egypt didn't just worship cats, it invented the modern celebrity. And while humans built statues and shrines in their honour, the cats simply blinked once, slowly. Egypt's greatest civilization reduced to their marketing department. As Egypt basked in its golden age of cat worship, another, quieter revolution was happening. Cats were going global. They didn't plan it, of course. Cats don't plan anything beyond nap here and kill that. But thanks to human trade routes, they began their great accidental migration, the cat diaspora. You see, ships in the ancient world were floating buffets for rodents. Grain, food stores and ropes, all prime real estate for vermin. And sailors, desperate to not have their bread eaten or their toes nibbled, started bringing cats aboard. Not because they loved them, but because they worked. Sort of. The cats did what they always do. They showed up, killed a few mice, napped in the sun, and occasionally knock something valuable into the sea. Sailors didn't mind. A cat on a ship was good luck. Unless, of course, it stared into the dark corner of the hull for too long, in which case the crew assumed it had seen a ghost, and everyone panicked. From the Nile to the Aegean, cats spread through trade like furry little diplomats of chaos. Egyptian merchants brought them to Greece, Phoenicia, and eventually Rome, where they were welcomed as both pest control and conversation pieces. It was the Bronze Age's version of a viral trend. Every port wanted a cat because Egypt had cats, and Egypt was cool. Unlike most animals, cats didn't need to be domesticated in each new place. They just stepped off the boat, saw the local rats, and started working freelance. The species didn't spread because humans wanted companionship. It spread because humanity had crumbs. As centuries passed, the cat became the unsung backbone of maritime history. They guarded granaries, accompanied armies, and slept through most of it. They crossed deserts, oceans, and borders, leaving paw prints in temples and tombs from Persia to Pompeii. And wherever they went, they left the same impression: efficient, mysterious, and ever so slightly condescending. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires burned. Philosophers debated the nature of the soul. The cats just kept travelling, surviving, and quietly judging every human innovation along the way. So while humans conquered the world for glory, cats did it by accident, and with much better posture. When cats finally padded their way into ancient Greece, they entered a civilization obsessed with beauty, order, and geometry. 3 things cats respect in theory, but destroy in practice. Before the feline invasion, Greeks relied on weasels for pest control. Yes, actual weasels, shrieking, feral little chaos gremlins who lived in people's homes and occasionally bit them. So when sailors brought over sleek Egyptian cats that didn't smell like death or steal your sandals, it was love at first nonchalant glance. Cats fit perfectly into the Greek aesthetic. They were elegant, self-contained, and completely indifferent, which, coincidentally, is how most philosophers described the gods. The Greeks admired restraint and composure, and the cat was basically the embodiment of both. Even Aristotle would have respected an animal that could ignore you so efficiently. Soon, cats became the new pets of the upper class, not the working kind of pets, like dogs, but the ornamental kind, like furniture that occasionally blinked. In Athens, they lounged in courtyards, basking in sunlight and existential superiority. Poets wrote about them, artists painted them, women adored them, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in a creature that was graceful, mysterious, and always slightly unimpressed. Meanwhile, the cats didn't care. They were still doing their job, hunting mice, lounging by oil lamps, and occasionally climbing onto important scrolls at exactly the wrong time. Every civilization that hosted them learned the same lesson. A cat will solve your rat problem, but it will replace it with an ego problem. The weasels, of course, were furious. They lost their jobs overnight. You can almost imagine them holding tiny picket signs outside granaries reading, "Egyptian imports are ruining local business." But nobody listened. Cats had better PR and much better fur. By the time of the Hellenistic period, cats had secured their place as both pest control and status symbol, the animal version of a philosopher's toga. They didn't obey commands, but they didn't need to. Simply existing gracefully was enough to make Greeks worship them. It was the perfect cultural fit, one society obsessed with reason and one animal that operated entirely without it. The Greeks tried to understand cats. The cats understood everything and just pretended not to. When the Romans adopted cats, they didn't just get pets. They got furry anarchists that ignored every social structure Rome ever invented. For an empire obsessed with law, order, and Latin grammar, cats were a walking contradiction. They did nothing, followed no rules, and somehow everyone still fed them. At first, Romans only wanted them for practical reasons. Grain was life, rats were death, and cats were the fluffy middlemen of survival. Roman warehouses, ships, and villas all kept a few, usually referred to as mures bellatores, mouse warriors. It sounds noble, but it mostly involved napping until something squeaked. Before cats, Romans used weasels and ferrets, which were efficient, but let's face it, not exactly photogenic. Cats, on the other hand, looked elegant even while committing murder. Soon they were appearing in mosaics, frescoes, and household shrines. Archaeologists have found Roman cat skeletons buried with care, proof that even the world's toughest soldiers went soft for a purr. But cats didn't care about Roman authority. They ignored legions, emperors, and even the occasional gladiator trying to impress them. Imagine Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, trying to call a cat and being met with slow blinking. That's power. They fit perfectly into Roman society precisely because they didn't fit at all. Romans admired independence, dignity, and controlled arrogance, all traits the cat embodied naturally. A senator could lecture about discipline all morning, then go home to a creature that refused to acknowledge his existence. Philosophically, it was humbling. Spiritually, it was infuriating. In time, cats spread to every corner of the empire, from Britain's rainy outposts to Egypt's sunlit ports. They patrolled Roman streets, taverns, and temples. Sailors kept them on ships, farmers in barns, and noblewomen on silk cushions. They were the equal opportunity companions of Rome, adored by patricians and peasants alike, though equally indifferent to both. By the empire's peak, cats were a quiet constant, small, silent, and smug as civilization collapsed around them. When Rome eventually fell, they didn't mourn it. They simply walked over the ruins, found the next grain store, and got back to work. The Romans built aqueducts and empires. The cats built legacies, one paw print at a time, while the cats of Egypt and Rome were busy reclining on cushions and perfecting the art of being worshipped. Something entirely different was happening thousands of miles east. In ancient China and Southeast Asia, a new species of cat-human cooperation was forming, not out of religion or romance, but out of sheer agricultural desperation. Here, farmers had a different kind of problem. Rice paddies, silk stores, and more rodents than anyone had time for. Enter the Asian leopard cat, Prionilurus bengalensis, smaller, wilder, and slightly more psychotic than its African cousin. It was a sleek, spotted hunter that didn't meow so much as it judged you in high definition. Unlike Egypt's pampered tabbies, these cats weren't divinely adored. They were tolerated like eccentric tenants who refused to leave. Farmers noticed that when these cats showed up, the mice disappeared. So they did the logical thing. They put out food and hoped for the best. The cats, predictably, took the food, murdered a few rodents, and never said thank you. This wasn't domestication. It was parallel evolution with a side of emotional distance. 2 continents, 2 human populations, and 2 completely separate species of wildcat, both coming to the same conclusion. These hairless apes might be worth freeloading off over generations. Some leopard cats became calmer, or at least stopped trying to claw their landlords. Farmers even started breeding them, which historians agree must have been an ambitious and deeply regretful decision. But these Asian domesticated cats never quite lost their wild streak. They were more decorative than affectionate, and while they excelled at pest control, they still regarded humans as suspicious roommates. In essence, they were the prototype for every modern cat that lets you pet it once, then disappears for 2 days. This second domestication event didn't last forever. Eventually, trade brought African cats eastward, sleeker, more adaptable, and slightly less murdery. The local cats were politely phased out, like an outdated software update that still occasionally crashes. Still, for a time, 2 distinct feline civilizations thrived, one basking in Egyptian gold, the other prowling Asian rice fields. 2 evolutionary branches, one shared personality, beautiful, mysterious, and absolutely uncooperative. It wasn't love. It was global conquest, achieved through silence, cuteness, and total disregard for instructions. For a brief, glorious moment in history, the world was divided, not by empire or ideology, but by cats. On one side, the African wildcat, sleek and self-assured, lounging in Mediterranean villas like a furry aristocrat. On the other, the Asian leopard cat, smaller, moodier, and living out in the rice fields like an underpaid assassin. These weren't just different breeds. They were different worldviews. The African cats were refined opportunists. You feed me, I'll let you think you own me. The Asian ones were pure freelancers. You exist, and that's fine. Don't make it weird. For a few thousand years, both civilizations coexisted without knowing the other existed. Two parallel feline societies separated by geography and the mutual belief that humans were kind of idiots. And then, inevitably, global trade ruined everything. As sailors and merchants began hopping between continents, the African cat went full colonizer. Adaptable, sociable, by cat standards, and slightly less homicidal, it spread eastward, to India, to China, even to the jungles of Southeast Asia. The local leopard cats didn't stand a chance. Within centuries, their bloodlines faded, absorbed by their cooler, calmer cousins. Geneticists call this introgression. Historians might call it the feline version of cultural assimilation. But to the cats, it was probably just Tuesday. The Asian leopard cats didn't vanish entirely. They just got out-evolved by a species that had perfected the art of pretending to care. By the Iron Age, the descendants of both were meeting for the first time, probably under a wagon, deciding who got to eat the rat first. From there, they interbred, merged, and gave rise to the modern domestic cat. A creature whose DNA still carries the memory of both ancestors, the African hunter's confidence and the Asian loner's distrust. Scientists today can literally see this double heritage in a cat's genes, and, frankly, in its personality. One moment it's affectionate, the next it's plotting your demise. It's not moody, it's bicultural. So yes, humanity domesticated cats twice, and the cats, in return, agreed to tolerate us once. They merged not for love nor loyalty, but simply because it was convenient. And if that isn't the purest expression of evolution, nothing is. By the time cats reached medieval Europe, they'd spent thousands of years perfecting their strategy. Stay quiet, look adorable, and let humans do the heavy lifting. It was working brilliantly, until Europe, in its infinite wisdom, decided that anything independent, quiet, and nocturnal must be working for the devil. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when logic was burned at the stake. Cats, especially black ones, suddenly went from holy protectors of the harvest to alleged servants of Satan. Why? Because they stared too long, they moved too gracefully, and they didn't bark on command. In other words, they were guilty of being cats. The church led the charge, accusing cats of witchcraft, heresy, and general suspicious vibes. Monks preached that their glowing eyes were portals to hell. Priests warned that witches could turn into cats at night, and the peasants, who already feared thunder, mirrors, and literacy, panicked. The result? A continent-wide cat purge. Thousands were killed, burned, or thrown from towers in the name of spiritual hygiene. It was a rough time to have whiskers. Even just feeding a stray could get you accused of consorting with the occult. Humanity, in one of its proudest moments, declared war on its own pest control system. The cats, naturally, withdrew. They went feral, vanished into barns and forests, and probably muttered something equivalent to, "Good luck, idiots." Without cats, rats flourished. Grain stores filled with droppings, towns swarmed with vermin, and fleas multiplied unchecked. Europe was becoming one giant biological warning label. The irony was almost cosmic. The very animal accused of summoning evil had been keeping real evil, in the form of plague-ridden rodents, at bay. This was the great medieval mistake, a case study in superstition triumphing over survival instinct. Humanity had managed to turn its best ally into an enemy, and nature took notes. The cats, of course, didn't care. They'd been worshipped by gods and murdered by fools. both experiences probably felt about the same, and while preachers droned about demons, the rats threw a party. A very large, very infectious party that would soon wipe out half of Europe. The moral? Never fire your best employee during a crisis. After centuries of treating cats like demonic freeloaders, Europe finally got what it deserved, a biology lesson written in corpses. It began quietly in the mid-14th century, a few rats on a few ships, carrying fleas full of Yersinia pestis, a bacterium with no sense of humour and an excellent work ethic. Within months, the Black Death was on tour. People blamed everything except the obvious. Some blamed the stars, others blamed foreigners. Many blamed God, who by that point was probably muttering, "I gave you cats for a reason." Towns emptied, crops rotted, and priests gave last rites faster than anyone could invent hand sanitizer. Meanwhile, the rats had a golden age. With cats nearly extinct from superstition and paranoia, the rodent population exploded. Fleas jumped, diseases spread, and human civilization turned into a cautionary tale. The cats, watching from the outskirts, probably took notes on how quickly humans could destroy themselves without assistance. By 1350, entire cities were ghost towns. 1/3 of Europe was gone. If there had been a medieval Yelp, the continent would have received 0 stars and a "would not recommend." The irony was thick enough to choke on. The church had condemned cats as evil, and now evil had shown up, microscopic, contagious, and delivered by the rats the cats used to eat. Eventually, people started to notice the pattern. Villages that still had a few cats seemed less dead. Maybe, just maybe, the furry little devil's helpers weren't so demonic after all. Slowly, cautiously, cats crept back into towns, like divine retribution wrapped in fur. They hunted the rats, reduced the fleas, and restored a semblance of balance. Of course, humanity didn't apologize. It never does. Instead, they just acted like the whole thing had been part of the plan. The church quietly stopped mentioning cats in sermons, peasants began feeding strays again, and the plague, insulted by the sudden competence, moved on to Asia. By the 15th century, the cat had reclaimed its throne, not through worship or politics, but through sheer, unbothered survival. While Europe buried its dead, the cats just yawned, stretched, and went back to work. The only creatures in history to win a holy war by doing absolutely nothing. When the smoke of the Middle Ages finally cleared, and half of Europe had either died, prayed itself hoarse, or invented new diseases, the cats returned. Not marching triumphantly, of course. That would have required enthusiasm. They just appeared one morning, stretching on rooftops, blinking at the sunlight, and pretending they'd been here the whole time. Europe didn't so much welcome them back as quietly pretend the whole demonic servant of Satan thing had been a misunderstanding. Towns that once hunted cats were now begging for them. Farmers built little shelters, nobles adopted them as house mascots, and monasteries kept them in libraries to guard against mice, a kind of reluctant holy reinstatement. The cats, naturally, accepted this redemption arc with total emotional neutrality. They didn't forgive, they didn't forget. They just resumed pest control and passive-aggressively shed on church manuscripts. To them, the plague had merely proven a point. Never underestimate the consequences of firing your best employee. By the Renaissance, cats had evolved from cursed creatures to cultural icons again. Painters included them in family portraits. Scholars kept them in studies. Queens paraded them as living jewellery. Leonardo da Vinci even sketched them mid-pounce, clearly impressed by something that could defy physics and etiquette at once. But even in their comeback, cats never gave too much. They refused obedience, ignored training, and offered affection only when it suited them. Humans called this mystery. Biologists call it behavioural dominance. From Egyptian temples to European castles, the pattern had come full circle. The cat's position in society rose, fell, and rose again, untouched by reason, religion, or rat. Every era thought it was using the cat. Every era was wrong. By the dawn of modernity, The cat had survived wars, plagues, and persecution, all without forming a single organized movement. Its strategy was simple: stay beautiful, stay silent, and let humanity collapse under its own enthusiasm. So ends the pre-modern chapter of our uneasy alliance. The cat began as a wild hunter, became a god, then a witch, then a roommate. It has outlived pharaohs, popes, and empires, and it still won't come when called. Because in the end, humans never truly domesticated cats. Cats just domesticated civilization. The Mongol horse was more than an animal. It was a heartbeat that pulsed through the veins of the steppe. Without it, the Mongol Empire would have been impossible. Every conquest, every migration, every battle depended on these short, muscular creatures with eyes that mirrored the horizon. They weren't bred for beauty, but for survival. They didn't prance, they endured. On the frozen plains where lesser beasts would perish, Mongol horses grazed through snow, scraping the icy crust with their hooves to reach the brittle grass below. To a Mongol, a horse wasn't property. It was kin. Herds roamed freely across the endless landscape, marked only by subtle brands and the memories of their masters. A Mongol could recognize his own horse's neigh amid 1,000 others. He could tell, by the rhythm of its steps in the dark, which one carried him home. There was no need for fences or barns. The land itself was their stable, and the sky their roof. From childhood, boys and girls alike were tossed onto the backs of colts before they could properly walk. Riding wasn't a skill, it was a birthright. Children learned balance on the moving back of life itself, clutching manes, not saddles. A Mongol child might fall, bleed, and rise again, but he would never fear the horse. Fear was for those who didn't belong to the wind. The horses themselves were unlike any in the world. Sturdy, broad-headed, with manes that tangled in the storms, they carried warriors from sunrise to moonlight without complaint. They needed no shelter, no grain, no comfort. Their strength came from the same hunger and cold that forged their riders. A good horse could sense a coming snowstorm before the clouds gathered. Another could find its way home through the pitch-dark steppe, guided only by memory and magnetism. In Mongol belief, the horse's spirit was sacred. Songs were sung to them, not about them. Warriors whispered to their mounts before battle as if speaking to a trusted comrade. To strike a horse unjustly was a sin. To lose one in cowardice was shame. The Mongols lived because their horses lived, and through them they conquered the world. For the Mongols, breeding horses was never a matter of design. It was a pact with nature. No royal stables, no gilded reins, no meticulous breeding ledgers guided their choices. The only law was survival. A horse that faltered in winter, stumbled in mud, or tired after a long ride simply didn't pass its strength to the next generation. The steppe culled the weak better than any human ever could. The result was a breed forged by frost, famine, and distance, a perfect balance of endurance, instinct, and stubborn will. Herds were vast, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. Each family maintained its own group, allowing them to roam across open pastures without fences or guards. Stallions battled fiercely for dominance, and only the strongest earned the right to mate. Mares that couldn't produce hardy foals were quietly released to the wild. No sentiment, no favoritism, only the quiet logic of the land. The Mongols believed that to interfere too much in breeding would insult the wisdom of the steppe. In spring, foals were born under the open sky. There were no barns, only the earth's warmth and the mother's breath. Mongol herders rarely handled them at first, letting nature shape their courage. A foal that stayed close to its mother during storms, that stood firm when wolves howled, that ran without tripping. These were the silent tests that decided its future. When the time came to separate the yearlings, the herders used lassos made from rawhide and songs passed down through generations. Their chants were rhythmic, meant to calm the herd and remind them that the human voice was part of the wind, not a threat against it. The chosen foals were branded with the family's mark, not to claim ownership, but to seal kinship. The Mongols didn't breed for size, colour, or showmanship. They bred for the horse that would carry them through freezing blizzards and endless wars, that would gallop from one end of an empire to the other without collapsing. In the end, every Mongol horse was both wild and wise, loyal and free. They weren't made by hands, but by hunger, storms, and the fierce mercy of the steppe itself. To understand Mongol horse care, one must first understand the land itself, a sea of grass that rolled from horizon to horizon, changing colour with the seasons but never its nature. The Mongols didn't own the steppe. They shared breath with it. The land was both cradle and battlefield, and their horses thrived in its extremes. There were no fences, no stables, no artificial boundaries. A horse might wander for days, yet always find its way back by scent, memory, and instinct sharper than any compass. Each family's herd was part of a larger rhythm. During summer, horses grazed on the lush plains near rivers and lakes, drinking freely and growing strong on the fat grasses. When winter came, the herds were driven to higher ground, where the snow was thinner and the wind stripped the grass bare. There, the horses learned to paw through ice for food, to eat frozen grass, and to survive without human help. Mongol horses didn't depend on men. They made men depend on them. Every few days, herders rode out to check their herds, not to feed or shelter them, but to observe. They studied how the animals grouped, how they moved, how the foals followed. The bond between herder and horse was built on patience, not possession. Mongols often said, "The steppe feeds what it loves and kills what it doesn't." That was not cruelty. It was understanding. When storms swept across the plains, the horses gathered in tight circles, heads turned inward, shielding the foals with their bodies. The humans watched and learned. Nature taught them how to survive, and they imitated her lessons. Mongol tents, called gurs, were round for that reason, the shape of endurance. Horses were never overworked or broken. After long campaigns or journeys, they were released to heal naturally. A warrior might own 100 mounts, rotating them between rest and battle, ensuring no single horse was ever driven to exhaustion. This was the secret behind Mongol mobility, the world's first system of animal logistics. While other empires bred horses for prestige, the Mongols bred them for partnership. The land raised them, the wind hardened them, and the riders honoured them. Together, they became unstoppable. A Mongol's relationship with his horse was intimate, practical, and sacred all at once. Every drop of sustenance the steppe offered came through these creatures: milk, sweat, and sometimes blood. When food was scarce, a warrior might open a vein in his horse's neck, drink a few mouthfuls of warm blood, and seal the wound with felt or ashes. The horse would live, the man would survive. It was not cruelty, but kinship, the sharing of life in the bleak arithmetic of survival. Mars's milk, known as airag or fermented kumis, was the drink of the steppe. It nourished nomads when grain was impossible to grow and water was locked beneath winter ice. To milk a mare was an art. The herder sang softly, stroking the neck, reminding her that she and her foal were safe. The milk was warm, sharp, and wild, just like the people who drank it. In summer, families fermented barrels of it, the air thick with its tang. Guests were greeted with a bowl of airag, and refusing it was like refusing the Mongol soul. Sweat was another offering. After long rides, a warrior wiped the foam from his horse's neck and rubbed it into his own skin, believing it gave him the beast's endurance and courage. It was half superstition, half science. Mongol warriors smelled of their mounts, a scent that mingled with wind and leather, masking them from enemies who relied on scent to track them. When winter tightened its grip and snow devoured the grass, Mongols slaughtered only the old or wounded. Every part of the horse was used: meat for food, hide for boots and tents, bones for tools, sinew for bowstrings. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. To care for a horse was to care for oneself. Mongol herders groomed them not for beauty, but to check for frostbite, injury, or infection. A horse's health was a mirror of its rider's spirit. If the animal grew sick, The family took it as a warning. Someone among them had grown careless or prideful. The Mongols didn't separate life from the herd. They were one body, breathing across the steppe, feeding one another through milk, sweat, and blood. In Mongol life, the herd was an extension of the family, not a possession. The horses grazed freely, and yet every man, woman, and child knew which animals were theirs. A family's fortune could be measured not in coins, but in hoofbeats, the rhythm of life echoing across the plains. Each horse had a name, often inspired by its colour or temperament. Wind's Child, Iron Hoof, Cloud Stepper. These weren't poetic indulgences but emotional bonds, spoken with the same affection reserved for kin. Women played a vital role in managing the herds. While men rode off to war or trade, it was often the women who milked, tamed, and tended to the animals. A skilled Mongol woman could ride as fiercely as any warrior and read the behaviour of the herd like a poem written in motion. She could tell which mare was ready to foal, which stallion was restless, and which young horse was destined to be a champion. Their eyes were their tools, their intuition sharper than any instrument. Children were introduced to the herd as soon as they could stand. Their toys were miniature saddles and bows, and their first lessons were about how to approach a horse gently, how to listen to its breathing, and how to fall without fear. Falling, in fact, was a rite of passage. A child who fell and rose without tears earned laughter and praise. The Mongols believed bravery began not in battle, but in the bond between rider and horse. During migrations, the herd moved with the family, forming part of the caravan that rolled endlessly across the grasslands. Horses carried not just warriors, but household goods, yurts, and even children bundled in furs. The herds grazed at night, while the families slept under the stars, guarded by the dogs and the hum of wind through horsehair ropes. There was no sharp divide between human and animal. Both were children of the same steppe. The Mongols believed that the horse's spirit lingered even after death, watching over its former rider. When a great warrior died, his favourite horse was often released rather than slain, set free to wander, to find its master again in dreams or in the wind that swept across eternity. Training a Mongol horse was not an act of domination. It was a conversation. The Mongols didn't break their horses as many settled civilizations did. They taught them through rhythm, repetition, and respect. A Mongol herder would spend days simply being near a young horse, speaking softly, mimicking its movements, letting trust grow like grass after spring rain. Only when the bond was visible in the animal's calm eyes would training begin. The first step was desensitization. Foals were introduced to sounds of wind, drums, and the crackle of fire early, so that nothing on the battlefield would frighten them. Children, light and agile, were often the first to mount them, bareback, with only a rope around the neck. The horse learned to follow shifts in weight rather than the pull of a bit. By adulthood, it could respond to the faintest pressure of a knee or the whisper of a command. Unlike the heavy war horses of Europe, Mongol mounts were small, often no taller than 13 hands, but their strength was hidden in endurance. They could travel 100 kilometers a day without tiring, thrive on minimal feed, and cross rivers or deserts with equal ease. A well-trained Mongol horse could gallop for hours, then stop on a dime, spin, and charge again. Obedient not from fear, but from partnership. Archery practice was a cornerstone of training. Riders would shoot arrows at full gallop, teaching their horses to maintain balance and speed without direction. The animals learned to anticipate their rider's rhythm, to slow slightly as the bow was drawn, to surge forward when the shot released. Over time, horse and rider moved as one being, breathing in sync. A Mongol horse could even find its rider after being separated in battle. Many accounts from enemies told of riderless horses returning to their camps, their saddles blood-stained, their eyes fierce and searching. The Mongols believed this loyalty came from the horse's spirit, bound by trust, not ownership. By adulthood, a horse was a steppe soldier, trained not for pageantry, but for war. It carried empires on its back, its hooves writing history into the earth. To ride one was to hold the pulse of the steppe beneath your hands, wild yet willing, free yet faithful. When the Mongols rode to war, their horses were both weapon and shield. Each warrior brought not one, but several mounts, sometimes up to 5, rotating them to preserve strength. While one galloped into battle, others grazed freely, resting until their turn came. This constant exchange kept the army moving with supernatural speed, covering distances no enemy believed possible. The Mongol horde was not an army. It was a tide of horses that never stopped moving. On campaign, the care of the animals came before sleep or food. Warriors would remove the sweat-crusted saddles, rub the horses with felt to dry their backs, and check hooves for injury. A cracked hoof could slow an entire unit, so spare horses followed every troop, carrying only the essentials: meat, milk, and weapons. At night, horses were tethered in loose circles around the camp, heads inward, ready to stampede outward if attacked. Even in silence, they served as an early warning system, the steppes living alarm bells. In peacetime, the same care continued. Horses were released to graze over open plains, to rebuild their strength and spirit. The Mongols believed that too much control weakened an animal's soul, so freedom was part of recovery. No Mongol ever lashed a horse from anger. Discipline came through trust, not punishment. A horse that trusted its master would ride through fire without hesitation. Horses were also central to spiritual rituals. Shamans performed blessings before long journeys or wars, brushing sacred smoke across the animal's flanks to protect them from evil spirits. If a horse fell in battle, a rider would whisper its name and leave a tuft of mane as tribute, thanking it for its service. To die in the saddle was honourable, but to let one's horse die in vain was shame beyond forgiveness. After a successful campaign, warriors shared milk and meat with their horses before feasting themselves, a silent acknowledgement of who had truly won the war. Peace, too, was a time for gratitude. Horses that had carried leaders or survived great distances were released to roam, forever free on the plains they once conquered. The Mongols understood a truth few civilizations grasped. Empire was built not on men alone, but on the endurance of their horses. In the harsh world of the steppe, survival was a matter of rhythm. Ride, rest, recover, repeat. The Mongols understood this instinctively. They treated their horses not as machines of war, but as living comrades whose health determined the fate of entire clans. When a horse limped or showed signs of fatigue, it was never abandoned. The rider would dismount, walk beside it for miles, whispering reassurance, allowing the creature to regain strength at its own pace. Compassion wasn't weakness, it was wisdom born of necessity. Healing began with observation. Mongol herders could spot illness in a horse simply by the way it breathed or stood against the wind. A drooping ear or sluggish tail told stories of imbalance. There were no veterinarians, only experience passed through generations. Remedies came from the earth itself: warmed animal fat for swelling, fermented mare's milk for internal illness, and ash mixed with herbs to disinfect wounds. A horse that survived such treatment became tougher, more trusted, a veteran of the steppe. After long journeys or battles, horses were turned loose to recover in vast open grasslands. The Mongols believed that nature healed better than any hand. The wind brushed away sweat, the grass calmed the stomach, and the freedom of movement restored spirit. A horse confined was a horse that forgot how to live. Freedom was medicine. The mares, in particular, were treated with gentle reverence. Their milk fed families, their foals renewed the herd, and their instincts guided migrations. During foaling season, the camp moved slower, allowing mares to rest. Even warriors hardened by war softened their voices around newborn foals. A Mongol child might be given the honour of naming a new horse, binding the next generation of rider to the next generation of steed. Rituals often accompanied recovery. Shamans tied strips of blue silk to the manes of sick or injured horses, symbolizing the eternal sky's blessing. When healing came, the ribbons were left to flutter away with the wind, carrying gratitude back to the heavens. To heal the herd was to heal the people. Every hoofbeat carried memory. Every mane held the whispers of wind and prayer. The Mongols knew the secret to endurance wasn't conquest. It was care, shared between man and beast. The Mongols believed every horse carried a fragment of the eternal blue sky, the divine essence that watched over all living things. To them, horses weren't just beasts of burden. They were vessels of spirit, born from wind and thunder. When a Mongol rode across the plains, he wasn't simply travelling. He was part of a cosmic dance between man, animal, and sky. In their stories, the first horse was said to have sprung from lightning, its mane a trail of flame, its hooves striking sparks that birthed the stars. This myth wasn't mere poetry. It captured a truth. The Mongols saw motion as sacred. Stillness meant death, but to ride meant life. Every gallop was a prayer, every snort a hymn to the sky god Tengri. When horses died, they weren't forgotten. Their skulls were sometimes placed atop hilltops or near river crossings, their hollow eyes facing the horizon. Travellers passing by would whisper blessings or tie blue silk ribbons, kadags, around their bones, thanking them for their service and asking for safe journeys ahead. Even in death, the horse remained a guardian of the steppe. During festivals, herders gathered to race their finest mounts, testing speed, endurance, and loyalty. There were no saddles, no whips, just rider and horse, flying together as one. Victory wasn't just pride, it was proof that the spirits favoured the family's herd. The winners weren't merely celebrated, they were blessed. Milk was poured onto the earth in offering, and songs rose into the wind, carrying gratitude to the heavens. The Mongols lived and died in the saddle. Their empires rose from the dust beneath hooves, their legends carved by speed and endurance unmatched in history. But beneath the power and conquest lay something gentler, a reverence that bound human and animal beyond words. A Mongol without his horse was like a sky without clouds, a flame without air. The horse's breath kept the rhythm of the world alive, its heart beating in time with the steppe itself. Even today, in the endless plains of Mongolia, you can still hear that rhythm, the whisper of hooves on grass, the echo of an ancient bond. It's the spirit of the steppe, eternal and unbroken. In the glittering yet dangerous court of ancient Macedon, privilege was never free. The sons of noblemen, youths born into luxury and expectation, were summoned to the palace not for comfort, but for discipline. These were the Paides Basilikoi, the royal pages. They were teenagers, often no older than 16, hand-picked to serve King Philip II, and later his son Alexander. To be chosen was both an honour and a warning. One was brought close to power not to enjoy it, but to prove loyalty to it. The life of a page began at sunrise. They weren't princes in training. They were attendants, shadows to greatness. They guarded the royal bedchamber, fetched weapons, poured wine, and ran messages during councils of war. They listened more than they spoke, memorizing every gesture, every tone of command. A careless word could end a family's favour. A single act of courage could secure its rise. Macedon's future generals began not with swords in hand, but with their heads bowed before the king. Yet this service was no humiliation, it was education. These boys lived among warriors and strategists. They watched Philip himself drill phalanxes, negotiate with rivals, and drink like a conqueror. Every order shouted in the courtyard, every punishment delivered for disobedience, was a lesson in monarchy and survival. They learned how to ride, fight, and, most importantly, how to obey. But beneath the surface of discipline ran something deeper: intimacy. The pages dined with the royal family, shared in festivals, and accompanied the king on hunts. Bonds formed, between youth and ruler, between the future and the present. These relationships were often emotional, even romantic, blurring the line between loyalty and affection. Macedon's court thrived on such tensions. Devotion to the king was as personal as it was political. When a page reached adulthood, he was expected to emerge not just skilled in warfare, but moulded in spirit, a soldier, diplomat, and companion who understood the heartbeat of the throne. Some would fall in disgrace, others would rise to legendary ranks. From these boys came the men who would one day ride with Alexander across Asia, the first generation of the Hetairoi, the companions. Their service began in silence, but it would echo through empires. Life as a royal page in Macedon was designed to strip arrogance and replace it with discipline. These boys, born into privilege, quickly learned that the palace was no playground. It was a forge. Every moment was a test of loyalty, courage, and restraint. They attended the king's hunts, served at his table, and stood guard through the night. It was said that the king slept more soundly when surrounded by the sons of his nobles, for no man would dare plot rebellion when his own heir stood as the king's servant. Training went beyond chores. Pages were schooled in reading, rhetoric, and the art of persuasion, skills that would later make them diplomats and commanders. But the true education lay in the drills. They practiced horseback riding until their thighs burned, learned to draw the Macedonian bow, and sparred in the courtyards where laughter was rare and bruises were frequent. They were taught not to flinch at pain, not to question orders, and never to turn their backs on their comrades. King Philip understood that loyalty wasn't inherited, it had to be conditioned. The pages were deliberately placed in positions of trust and temptation. They carried his weapons, guarded his tent, and even bore his messages to generals and queens. To betray such confidence would mean not only one's own death, but the ruin of one's entire family. The system was brutal, yet ingenious. It ensured that the future elite of Macedon were tied personally, emotionally, and politically to the crown. The days were long, but the lessons were lasting. From serving wine to the king during feasts to helping him mount his horse before battle, every act drilled obedience into the young nobles. Yet this service also gave them access to power. They saw how Philip manipulated allies, punished rivals, and rewarded loyalty with estates or command. The pages observed the anatomy of kingship from the inside out. In time, many of these youths would become more than courtiers. They would be the Hetairoi, the king's elite companions and cavalry officers. The line between servant and successor blurred. Loyalty became ambition, and ambition was the spark that would one day follow Alexander the Great across the known world. As the royal pages matured, their training evolved from obedience to mastery. Those who proved themselves worthy, through loyalty, endurance, and sharp intellect, were elevated into a brotherhood that would change history, the Hetairoi, or companions. This was the highest honour in Macedon. They were no longer servants of the king. They were his chosen few, his inner circle, and his cavalry elite. The Hetairoi were more than soldiers. They were bonded to the monarch by friendship, shared danger, and mutual respect. A page who became a companion was granted not only a horse and armour, but also proximity to the throne. To fight beside the king was both a privilege and a burden. Every man in the companion cavalry was expected to die before allowing harm to reach the monarch. Their loyalty was not demanded. It was proven in every charge. The origins of this institution stretched back to Philip II, who reshaped Macedon's military into a war machine. He knew that a king's safety could not rely on mercenaries or politics. It needed men who loved him as they loved their own kin. The young nobles who had grown up serving him were ideal candidates. They had seen the man behind the crown. They knew his temper, his strategies, his humour, and his ambitions. That familiarity bred not contempt, but devotion. By the time Alexander inherited his father's throne, the Hetairoi had become the backbone of Macedon's military genius. These were not common soldiers. They were thinkers on horseback, warriors trained in both combat and counsel. Alexander expanded their role, making them his advisors and confidants during campaigns. When he charged into Persia, he rode at the head of the companions, a gleaming spear point of discipline and daring. Yet this transformation, from page to companion, was not guaranteed. Many boys never made it that far. Some faltered under pressure, Others fell in training, and a few learned that proximity to power was as dangerous as any battlefield. But for those who succeeded, immortality awaited. Their names, Clytus, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, would be remembered not as servants of a king, but as brothers of an empire. The Hetairoi were born from loyalty, but they lived on through legend. To be a companion was not merely to serve the king, it was to share in his soul. The Hetairoi of Macedon were bound to their ruler by oaths deeper than family ties, and sometimes by emotions that defied politics. In the royal court, affection and loyalty were intertwined. The Greeks might call it philia, the love between men forged through shared struggle. But in Macedon, it was something fiercer. These bonds were born in youth, during the years as royal pages. The boys lived together, trained together, bled together. They watched each other grow from frightened nobles' sons into hardened horsemen. That intimacy created a loyalty no bribe or threat could break. The king's presence intensified it. To serve him was to orbit a living son, both life-giving and dangerous. A word of praise from the king could make a boy immortal. A moment of anger could ruin his family. Under Philip and later Alexander, the line between companionship and love often blurred. Alexander's bond with Hephaestion was the most famous. Two souls, as one ancient writer put it, sharing one heart in two bodies. Their relationship reflected Macedonian ideals, a union of loyalty, intellect, and bravery. Hephaestion had once been a page, serving humbly before standing at Alexander's side as general and confident. His love was not seen as weakness, but as proof of devotion that made him fearless in battle and wise in counsel. These relationships strengthened the Macedonian war machine. In the phalanx and cavalry, no soldier wanted to fail in front of his comrades, or worse, before his king. Shame was more feared than death. When they rode into battle, the companions didn't just fight for conquest, they fought for each other's eyes, for the honour of being remembered by those who mattered. The bonds of the Hetairoi were tested repeatedly, in court intrigues, on distant battlefields, and in moments of jealousy. Alexander rewarded devotion, but despised betrayal. Those who broke faith met swift punishment, for in his mind, treason against him was treason against love itself. Thus the companions were not just warriors, they were fragments of the king's own heart, bound together by blood, sweat, and something even stronger, the undying need to belong to glory. Becoming a companion required more than noble birth, it demanded transformation. The same boys who once poured wine and tended horses for the king now had to prove they could command men, survive the front lines, and act with unshakable resolve. Their education as pages had forged loyalty. Now came the crucible of war. Macedon's army was not a playground for aristocrats. It was a proving ground that swallowed the weak. Training began with the horse. From youth, Macedonian nobles learned that mastery of riding meant mastery of life. The companions fought as heavy cavalry, wielding long spears called ziston, charging headlong into enemy lines. But they didn't rely on brute strength alone. They learned precision, how to pivot their mounts at full gallop, strike, retreat, and strike again. Horses were trained to respond to knees and whistles, allowing riders to fight hands-free. Every movement had to flow like breath, for hesitation meant death. Their discipline extended to every aspect of life. Meals were simple, sleep was short, and drills were relentless. The young warriors practiced formation riding, simulated ambushes, and long-distance marches under scorching sun or freezing rain. Even in peace, the Macedonian camp was a living machine of readiness. The companions were drilled to adapt, to ride over mountains, ford rivers, and fight in terrain that would cripple lesser cavalry. Alexander the Great, who had been trained among them, believed the companions should embody both strength and intellect. He encouraged debate, philosophy, and storytelling among his soldiers. They were expected to think like generals, not just fight like brutes. To follow Alexander was to embrace his restless mind, to see conquest not as bloodshed, but as destiny. The bond between rider and horse mirrored that between companion and king. absolute trust, built through patience and trial. A good horse would die before abandoning its rider, and the same was expected of the man. In return, both were honoured. After battles, Alexander would walk among the wounded, praising the horses as much as the men who rode them. To the Macedonians, courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. And in mastering themselves, the companions became something more than soldiers. They became the living embodiment of Macedon's power, intellect, and ambition. Within the Macedonian court, the hetairoi were not just soldiers, they were the king's shadow. To outsiders, they appeared as generals and companions, but to those inside the royal sphere, they were the machinery of the monarchy itself. They guarded his person, shared his table, and advised him on matters of politics, diplomacy, and war. Every decision the king made echoed through the voices of these men who had once been his pages. When Philip II ruled, the companions were extensions of his ambition. They carried his strategies across Greece, spreading Macedonian dominance one campaign at a time. Philip dined and drank with them, listening to their opinions, encouraging debate, but always reminding them who sat at the head of the table. For Philip, the hetairoi were both brothers and tools, cherished, trusted, and occasionally sacrificed. Under Alexander the Great, that relationship deepened into something mythic. He had grown up among them, shared their tutors, their hunts, their bruises. They were not courtiers to him. They were fragments of his own past, elevated to immortality. His tent became a moving court where the companions discussed philosophy, war, and destiny. Men like Hephaestion, Ptolemy, and Perdiccas were not mere advisors. They were the scaffolding upon which Alexander's empire was built. In battle, the king led from the front, and his companions rode beside him. Their armour gleamed brighter, their spears struck truer, not because they were better men, but because they rode for a friend they called king. When Alexander charged, they followed without hesitation, forming the unbreakable wedge that shattered Persian lines again and again. To fail him was unthinkable. To die for him was glory. But being part of the inner circle was perilous. The closer one stood to the sun, the greater the risk of burning. Jealousy, rivalry, and suspicion brewed among the companions, especially as Alexander's divinity grew and his temper darkened. Some fell victim to his wrath, others to their own pride. Still, the idea of the hetairoi endured, a king surrounded not by sycophants, but by equals in courage. They were Macedon's finest creation, a fusion of friendship and power, intellect and loyalty, welded together by the flame of kingship itself. When the companions thundered into battle, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath them. The hetairoi were the cutting edge of Macedon's war machine, its spearhead, its heartbeat. No army in the ancient world possessed cavalry like theirs. They were not just horsemen but tacticians, poets of motion who turned chaos into rhythm. Their formation, the wedge, was Alexander's signature, an arrow of men and horses aimed directly at the enemy's heart, with the king himself at the tip. Each charge was a work of precision. Trumpets would sound, the phalanx would lock shields, and the companions would wheel forward, their long Xyston spears levelled like a forest of bronze. Dust and thunder filled the air. To their enemies, it looked like madness. To them, it was music. They rode in perfect synchronization, each man trusting the rider beside him more than his own life. They knew that one mistake, a hesitation, a broken line, could spell disaster. At the Battle of Chaeronea, the young Alexander first led the companions into combat beside his father. His charge shattered the Athenian line, proving the power of unity between man and king. Years later, at Gaugamela, when facing the full might of Persia, Alexander repeated the maneuver. Surrounded and outnumbered, he aimed his companions straight at Darius himself. The Persian army broke, not from numbers lost, but from the sight of Macedonian courage bearing down like fate. To be a companion in such moments was to live on the edge of mortality. The noise, the heat, the stench of blood, all vanished into a single focus. Protect the king, strike the enemy, do not fall. When the wedge broke through enemy ranks, it was not just a victory of arms. It was the culmination of years of loyalty, training, and brotherhood. After battle, the companions were the first to drink with Alexander, their armour still splattered with dust and blood. The king would walk among them, calling each by name, praising their valour, mourning their dead as brothers. In those moments, hierarchy dissolved. They were not nobles and monarch. They were men bound by triumph, by loss, and by the shared ecstasy of survival. For the companions, glory was not fame. It was the eternal memory of having charged beside a god. Power in Macedon was as intoxicating as it was perilous. For the Hetairoi, being close to the king meant walking a knife's edge. Every smile, every word, every silence carried weight. The same proximity that gave them glory also exposed them to envy, suspicion, and the deadly volatility of royal moods. In Philip's court, and even more so under Alexander, the favour of the king was both armour and target. Philip II had used charm and fear in equal measure to keep his companions loyal. One feast might end with gold and wine, another with a dagger in the dark. The young nobles learned quickly that loyalty was not only a virtue, but a survival skill. To question the king, even with good intentions, could be seen as treason. Yet to flatter him too eagerly invited mockery. The perfect companion was bold in battle, but humble at court, a balance few mastered for long. Under Alexander, the dangers multiplied. As his empire grew, so did his pride and paranoia. The man who had once embraced his companions as brothers began to view them as potential threats. Some of his closest friends fell victim to his suspicion. Clytus the Black, who had once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, was struck down by the king himself in a drunken rage after daring to speak too freely. The tent that had once echoed with laughter now harboured whispers and fear. To be loved by Alexander was both a blessing and a curse. Hephaestion, his truest friend, was adored beyond measure, but even he bore the crushing weight of expectation. When Hephaestion died, Alexander's grief was apocalyptic. He ordered days of mourning across his empire, executed doctors, and deified his fallen companion. The message was clear. The king's affection was divine, and to lose it was a death sentence. Still, men vied for that affection. The companions understood that the king's favour was the only currency that mattered in a world built on conquest. They risked not only their lives, but their souls for it. In Macedon, the bond between ruler and warrior was never equal. It was an unending struggle between devotion and power, where love could elevate or destroy with a single glance. When Alexander the Great's campaigns finally ended, the world he built trembled under the weight of its own glory. The Hetairoi, who had once followed him from Macedon to India, stood as living relics of a vanished age, men who had seen gods bleed and kings weep. Their loyalty had shaped an empire, but without Alexander's unifying presence, that same loyalty fractured into ambition. The brotherhood that had once charged as one now found itself divided across continents. After the king's death in Babylon, the companions were torn between grief and opportunity. Some wept beside his body, refusing to believe the man who led them through deserts and victories was gone. Others, practical, hardened by years of conquest, turned immediately to politics. Ptolemy seized Egypt, Lysimachus took Thrace, Antigonus claimed Asia Minor, and Seleucus marched east. Each had once been a friend, a fellow page or companion. Now they were rivals, carving the empire like vultures circling divine remains. Yet, even as they fought one another, they carried the spirit of Macedon within them. The discipline, courage, and cunning forged in Philip's court and refined under Alexander did not die. The companions became kings, governors, and founders of dynasties that lasted centuries. Their cavalry formations influenced armies from Rome to Persia. The idea of the Hetairoi, a ruler surrounded by trusted warriors bound by personal loyalty, echoed across ages, from medieval knights to imperial guards. But there was tragedy in their triumph. The brotherhood that had once stood for loyalty above all became a memory. Beautiful, broken, and mythic. The same intimacy that had made the companions invincible also made their downfall inevitable. Without the king, there was no sun to orbit, no heart to bind them. Macedon, once unstoppable, became just another fractured kingdom on the map. Still, history remembered them, not merely as conquerors, but as symbols of perfect unity between man, horse, and destiny. Their graves stretch from Greece to India, silent beneath foreign skies, but their legend endures. The Hetairoi began as boys serving at a king's bedside, and ended as men who ruled the world. In their rise and fall lies the eternal truth of Macedon, that loyalty, when given to greatness, can shake the earth, and when betrayed, can shatter empires. In the royal halls of Macedon, the banquet table was a battlefield of a different kind. Beneath the flicker of torches and the scent of roasted meat, alliances were forged, rivalries exposed, and loyalty tested over goblets of wine. These feasts were not mere indulgence, they were extensions of the throne itself. To dine with the king was to step into the orbit of power, where every gesture, every toast, and every silence could shift the course of history. The table was long and heavy, carved from oak and polished smooth by generations of elbows and spilled wine. Around it sat the Hetairoi, the companions, Macedon's elite. Warriors, nobles, and childhood friends of the king, they feasted not as subjects, but as brothers. The king did not dine apart on a throne. He sat among them, his cup overflowing, his laughter carrying across the hall. It was said that in these moments, Philip and later Alexander blurred the line between ruler and comrade, turning monarchy into fraternity. Every banquet began with ritual. Before the first drink, a libation of wine was poured upon the floor in honour of Zeus and Heracles, the divine ancestors of Macedon's kings. The companions then lifted their cups in unison, swearing oaths of loyalty, to the gods, to the king, and to one another. Wine flowed freely, but these were not mindless revels. Behind the songs and laughter hid politics, subtle and sharp. A raised eyebrow from the king could grant favour. A jest taken too far could cost a man his position, or his life. Music filled the halls, lyres, pipes, and rhythmic clapping from soldiers who had faced death together. The air grew thick with smoke, laughter, and the smell of roasted lamb and honeyed bread. Yet amid the merriment, the underlying tension never vanished. Every man at the table knew that tomorrow they might ride to war, and tonight's toast could be their last. For the Macedonians, the banquet was a mirror of their world, half camaraderie, half contest. It was here that bonds were sealed with wine, oaths were whispered over spilled blood, and brotherhood was reforged in the shadow of kings. The feast was not just a celebration, it was a ritual of loyalty, courage, and destiny. No Macedonian banquet began without wine, and no wine was drunk without an oath. The vessel of camaraderie was also the cup of destiny. Each feast opened with a libation to Zeus and Heracles, the divine ancestors of the Macedonian kings. The first drops of wine were spilled onto the earth, symbolizing reverence to the gods who governed fate. Only then could men drink freely, knowing they shared in both mortal joy and divine witness. But these gatherings were not drunken free-for-alls. They were carefully staged rituals of loyalty and equality. When the king raised his cup, every companion followed. In that gesture lay a silent oath, an affirmation that their hearts beat in rhythm with the monarch's. One wine, one blood, the Macedonians said, for the wine they drank was not just fermented grape, it was the lifeblood of unity. The feasts often came before war. On the eve of battle, the king would pour a final libation, dedicating victory or death to the gods. The companions would touch their cups to their lips, eyes fixed on the king's as if to say, "Where you go, we follow." In that moment, the lines between ruler and subject disappeared. Every man was bound by the same fate, sealed by the same drink. Oaths made at the banquet were binding. A promise, sworn under the gaze of the gods and the king, could not be broken without consequence. To break such an oath was not just treason, it was sacrilege. The The Macedonians believed the gods listened most closely when wine flowed, for truth revealed itself in the warmth of intoxication. And yet the ritual of wine also exposed the cracks within the brotherhood. A single careless toast, a drunken jest, could ignite years of loyalty into flames of envy. Kings and generals alike fell to words spoken over the table. But still, they drank. Because to refuse the cup was to refuse the bond, to step outside the circle of fellowship that had carried Macedon from a small kingdom to the conqueror of the world. In every goblet, there was both celebration and peril. The wine united them, but it also reminded them that loyalty, like drink, could turn sour overnight. The Macedonian feast was not merely an affair of food and drink, it was a rite of unity sealed in wine and blood. When the torches burned low and the music softened, the mood shifted from revelry to ritual. The hetairoi, the companions, rose from their seats, gathered around the king, and performed the ancient ceremony that bound them closer than family. A sacrificial animal, often a bull or a ram, was brought forth. The priest would invoke the gods of war and oaths, usually Ares, Zeus, and Heracles, calling them to witness the covenant about to be renewed. As the animal's blood spilled onto the earth, the companions dipped their hands or the tips of their swords into it. Each man then touched the king's cup, staining the rim red. It was not barbarism, it was symbolism. The blood meant life shared, danger shared, destiny shared. Afterward came the oath. The words were simple but absolute: loyalty to the king, protection of the brotherhood, and death before betrayal. The Macedonians believed the gods punished oath-breakers in both life and afterlife. For them, loyalty wasn't political, it was sacred. A man who turned against his comrades turned against the divine order itself. Once the ritual ended, the tension eased. The men embraced, drank again, and shouted their war cries into the night. They smeared blood across their foreheads like war paint, laughing in the face of death. It was as if they were daring the gods themselves to test the strength of their bond. For these warriors, friendship was not born of sentiment. It was hammered in the fire of shared hardship. They had marched across deserts, crossed frozen rivers, and faced armies 10 times their size. The banquet ritual reminded them that they lived and died not as individuals, but as a single force. Later, when Alexander carried Macedon across Asia, he continued the same blood rituals before his greatest battles. At Gaugamela, before facing the vast Persian host, he and his companions shared wine mixed with sacrificial blood. The men who charged beside him that day did so, knowing their oath had already been sealed in the oldest currency of loyalty, the lifeblood of kings and brothers alike. As the wine deepened and the torches flickered low, music began to weave its spell across the Macedonian hall. The feast transformed into theatre, half ritual, half rebellion against mortality. For Macedonians, song was not entertainment, it was history, memory and prophecy sung aloud. Lyres plucked softly, flutes wailed like distant winds, and drummers kept the pulse of the army even in times of peace. The musicians were often soldiers themselves, men who had fought alongside the companions. Their songs praised courage, mocked cowardice, and reminded every man that glory was fragile. A well-placed verse could immortalize a warrior, or ruin him. One famous ballad told of Clytus the Black saving Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus. Another, whispered in darker corners, hinted at his later death at the king's own hand. Macedonian music was both celebration and warning. During the feasts, the songs moved from light-hearted revelry to solemn chants. The companions would join in chorus, pounding their fists on the table in rhythm, shouting names of fallen comrades. It was not mourning, it was defiance. By singing of the dead, they kept them among the living. The hall would shake with voices calling to ghosts, laughter mixing with tears, as though the entire army, living and dead, feasted together under one roof. The king, too, took part. Philip was known to lead songs himself, his booming voice carrying over the crowd. Alexander, raised in that same tradition, brought a more refined spirit to the ritual. He often asked poets to recite Homeric verses, invoking Achilles and Patroclus, heroes whose friendship mirrored his own bonds with the companions. The implication was clear. They were not merely soldiers, they were living myth. As the night stretched on, the music quickened, urging men to dance. Boots struck the floor in wild rhythm, cups were raised, and blades flashed in drunken choreography. It was chaos made sacred, a reminder that valor was born not only in battle, but in the shared ecstasy of life itself. For the Macedonians, music was memory. Every note told the story of who they were and why they fought. And as the last song faded into the smoky dawn, the silence left behind was not emptiness. It was the sound of an oath renewed in every heart. The night before a great battle, the Macedonian banquet became something more than celebration. It became ceremony. Soldiers, officers, and the king himself gathered under the open sky, their armour gleaming in the firelight, their breath misting in the cool air. There was laughter, but it carried a sharp edge. Everyone knew that by the next sunset, some of those voices would be gone. And so they feasted, not to forget death, but to stare it in the face and toast it. The cooks prepared simple but symbolic food, roasted lamb for strength, bread baked in round loaves to symbolize unity, and wine mixed strong to dull fear. The companions sat close to the king, forming a ring of trust that mirrored their cavalry formation. No walls separated them from the night. The same sky that would hang over the battlefield awaited them tomorrow. Alexander often chose such moments to speak. He didn't lecture like a ruler. He spoke as one of them. He reminded them of home, of parents and sons, of the victories already won. His words were not empty inspiration. They were fuel, poured into the fire that already burned in their hearts. Then came the ritual to the gods. The king poured libations to Zeus, Heracles, and to Nike, goddess of victory. Every man raised his cup, calling upon his own patron spirit. Some invoked Ares, others Dionysus. The Macedonians believed the gods marched with them, not as distant observers, but as companions who shared their blood and wine. As the fires burned lower, the mood shifted. The songs slowed, replaced by quiet conversation. Some sharpened swords, others whispered farewells, or carved small markings into their shields, symbols to help their spirits find home should they fall. A few stared silently into the flames, lost in thought, imagining the clash of dawn. When the king finally dismissed them, they left in silence. The only sounds were the soft clink of armour and the restless whinny of horses sensing what lay ahead. The next day, they would ride into battle together, not as individuals, but as a single living organism forged by loyalty, courage, and ritual. The feast before battle was never about indulgence. It was a final communion before facing eternity. In most kingdoms, a ruler dined apart, elevated, untouchable, divine by distance. But in Macedon, the king sat among his men. The banquet hall was the great equalizer, where kingship met camaraderie and wine dissolved hierarchy. Philip II had begun this custom, breaking the Greek mould of royal isolation. His son Alexander perfected it, using the banquet not only to inspire loyalty, but to cultivate intimacy. When the companions feasted with their king, they saw not a distant god, but a man who laughed, argued, and drank beside them. Alexander would clasp shoulders, share jokes, and listen as freely as he commanded. In those hours, the crown became invisible. Yet that equality was an illusion carefully maintained. It made his men feel honoured, not entitled. They were equals in courage, but only one could embody destiny. The king drank last, but his toasts set the rhythm of the night. Each cup he raised carried weight. To the companions, he'd begin, who have stood with me in sun and storm. The hall would roar in response, wine sloshing, blades tapping the floor in salute. It was ritual disguised as revelry, a reaffirmation of the sacred bond between king and warrior. No decree or law could bind them more tightly than that shared drink. The conversations that followed were as strategic as any council meeting. Generals spoke freely, offering advice or teasing one another over past glories. Alexander encouraged debate, sometimes even provoked it. He wanted his companions sharp, fearless in speech, as in combat. But the line between honesty and insolence was perilously thin. One careless insult, one misread jest, could turn laughter into violence. Philip had learned this lesson brutally. One drunken insult from a noble once ended in bloodshed across the table. Alexander, too, would one day experience the same fate when Clytus the Black, his old saviour and friend, fell to his sword in a drunken quarrel. The banquet, for all its warmth, was a forge of both loyalty and tragedy. Still, the ritual endured because it captured the essence of Macedon, a nation built on shared strength, where the king was first among warriors, and the feast was the throne on which unity was crowned each night. No Macedonian feast ended without danger. Wine, in all its glory, carried both truth and destruction in equal measure. What began as a celebration of unity often turned into a crucible where tempers, jealousy, and pride boiled to the surface. For the hetairoi, wine stripped away the masks of diplomacy. Under its spell, the brave became boastful, the loyal became bold, and the king himself became mortal, capable of rage as fierce as his love. Philip II's banquets were notorious for their volatility. He encouraged open debate, believing that honesty born of wine revealed a man's true character. Yet honesty, once unbridled, often drew blood. One drunken insult cost him his eye, another nearly his throne. Macedon's history was littered with scars inflicted at the table rather than the battlefield. Still, the king never abandoned the ritual. To him, danger was the proof of brotherhood. Only among true men could words wound as deeply as swords. Alexander inherited that same faith in fellowship, but his banquets carried the weight of empire. As his victories grew, so did the tension among his companions. Old friends resented new favourites. Veterans whispered against foreign customs creeping into Macedonian life. The wine flowed as freely as ever, but so did suspicion. It was during one such feast that tragedy struck, the infamous night when Clytus the Black, the man who had once saved Alexander's life, challenged his king too loudly and too honestly. Enraged, Alexander killed him with a spear. The hall that had echoed with laughter fell silent. The blood on the floor mixed with spilled wine, a grim reflection of the rituals that once bound them. The companions saw that even brotherhood had limits when tested by pride and power. Yet the banquets continued. To stop would have been to admit weakness, to break the very rhythm of Macedonian life. They drank again, toasted again, sang again, because to be Macedonian was to live with contradictions. The wine that united them also destroyed them, and they accepted both fates with equal courage. In those halls of light and shadow, kings and warriors alike learned the same lesson, that the price of truth among brothers is always paid in blood, and still they drank. After every storm came renewal. Even in the wake of bloodshed, the Macedonians clung to their brotherhood as if it were the only thing keeping the world from splintering apart. The day after a quarrel or a tragedy, the same men who had drawn swords over insults would meet again at the table. No apologies were spoken, only silence, shared cups, and the understanding that the bond of comradeship was stronger than words. This ability to heal without confession was what made the hetairoi unbreakable. Their unity wasn't gentle. It was forged through friction, like iron in a smith's fire. Every argument, every wound, every death reminded them of their shared mortality. They had seen the worst in one another and still chose to stay. That was the secret of Macedonian strength. Not perfect harmony, but endurance through chaos. At these reconciliatory banquets, the rituals took on deeper meaning. The king would pour libations to the gods, not for victory, but for forgiveness. The companions would join in, drinking slowly, their laughter subdued. They toasted not the triumphs of battle, but the men who had fallen to pride and passion. Even Alexander, haunted by Clytus's death, sought purification through such feasts. He invited priests, philosophers, and musicians, turning the banquet into a bridge between guilt and redemption. The songs changed too. Gone were the wild chants of conquest. In their place came hymns to unity and remembrance. The companions sang of the river that carried both blood and wine, of brothers lost and found again in the endless march of destiny. The hall, once a place of rivalry, became a sanctuary, a space where warriors could remember that they were not gods, but men bound by shared fragility. By the time the cups were emptied and the torches burned low, something sacred had been restored. The Macedonians knew their tempers could ignite kingdoms, and their loyalty could found empires, but without reconciliation, both were meaningless. So they drank, not to forget, but to remember who they were together. Each renewed feast was a silent oath, that no matter how far they rode or how much blood was spilled, the brotherhood would endure. Wine had broken them, yes, but it also mended them, again and again, long after the Macedonian Empire fractured, and the companions became kings of their own realms. The spirit of the banquet lived on. Across Egypt, Persia, and Asia, echoes of those nights in Pella and Babylon lingered. The laughter, the oaths, the blood spilled, and the songs sung. The feast had been more than a custom. It was the pulse of Macedonian identity. Wherever a former companion raised a cup, the old bond was reborn for a moment, glowing like an ember in the ashes of empire. In Alexandria, Ptolemy held banquets to honor the memory of Alexander, mixing Greek ritual with Egyptian grandeur. In Seleucia and Antioch, Macedonian generals turned kings imitated the old symposia, seating themselves among their captains, pouring libations to Zeus and Heracles, and retelling tales of the days when they had feasted with the boy who conquered the world. The ceremony had become myth, part nostalgia, part statecraft. To feast like Alexander was to invoke legitimacy, to remind everyone that they were heirs not just to a throne, but to a brotherhood. But the meaning of the ritual changed. The intimacy faded, replaced by politics. The kings who came after Alexander used banquets to display power, not share it. What had once been a circle of equals became a theatre of hierarchy. The toasts grew grander, the wine sweeter, but the laughter rang hollow. The sacred simplicity of Macedon's old feasts, the raw fellowship of warriors who faced death together, was lost beneath gold and ceremony. Still, the memory endured in legend. Poets and historians wrote of the nights when Alexander and his companions sat shoulder to shoulder, their armour piled at their feet, their futures unwritten. The image became eternal. A king who shared his cup, a band of brothers bound by wine, oaths, and war. Even centuries later, generals and emperors sought to recreate that magic. From Roman commanders in Gaul to Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, all borrowed the Macedonian model of unity through ritual dining. And though none truly matched it, the idea survived. The belief that loyalty is not forged in marble halls, but around firelight, where men drink as one before facing fate. The legacy of the Macedonian feast was never empire. It was brotherhood itself, immortalized in wine and memory.